Have you ever noticed that it seems like there's lots of worship leading job openings, and probably not just worship leading jobs, but youth pastors, pastoral staff. But I'm subscribed to a couple different staffing agencies, and I'm getting emails at least once a week of churches that are looking to hire. And sometimes I even get phone calls saying, "Hey, we came across your resume and think you might be a good candidate for this." Or even more locally, I will get a call from a pastor here in Kansas City reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, our church is in need of hiring. Do you know of somebody looking?" And so it's kind of like that verse, and I'm trying not to take it out of context here, but the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Why do you think your church might still be struggling to hire your next worship leader? Stick around, and I want to share with you the 5 mistakes churches are making. Well, if you're checking me out for the first time and you've come across this episode of the Curtis Biswell Show and you're curious what I am about and what this channel's about, well, my vision is to create a thriving community where worshipers are raised up in character, competence, and cognitive health. What I do is I'm constantly thinking about issues I see, problems I see, and opportunities I see. And my brain is in overdrive mode a lot of times as I'm continually using the genius or the gift of wonder and trying to figure out like how could we solve this problem? How could we benefit, or how could we resource churches more in this worship leading shortage specifically? That's what this episode is about today. And so first, before I address the 5 mistakes churches are making, I did do a little bit of a poll, and I did hear back from a couple different pastors, and I coupled that with some of the conversations I've been having with local pastors as of late. So I wanted to first start with, here's some of what pastors are saying and why they are struggling to hire their next worship leader. One said, good musicians attract good musicians. And so he's a pastor at a smaller church. They're not completely rural, but they're in a smaller town on the Missouri side. And he said, man, we don't have a lot of musicians. And he was very honoring and he was very respectful. But he said the ones that we have, they get the job done. But he says, I think that's part of the reason why we're struggling to attract other musicians and potentially even worship leaders, because good musicians will attract good musicians. So it's harder to find that help. Another pastor I was talking with, he said, man, we've just kind of, we are missing, I think he phrased it like this, we're missing the sexy factor, or at least that's his observation, because his church is in a rural community, and he finds that it's a lot harder for him to get people, or worship leaders specifically, interested in checking out the position or even hiring that position, because maybe it's the church in town that has more of this sexy factor. And so he feels like, man, I just can't compete with that. And so I think that's why it's hard to fill this worship leader role. Another one I heard from actually a staffing agency. I was in conversations with them a couple months ago, and I just asked them, why do you think there is a shortage in worship leaders right now? Or at least it seems like there is. They said, man, we are seeing an uptick in people that aren't really looking to relocate. And so they've established a community, a home, and a base wherever they are, and they're just they like where they are, and they just don't really have a desire to move and to relocate. And some of that has to do with the cost of living in certain cities and certain areas. Maybe it's also a combination of the housing market, but we're not going to dive deep into all that. But those are some reasons, or some areas that pastors or even staffing agencies are noticing. And so now for the remainder of the episode, I've kind of just been doing some observing myself over the last few years intentionally as I've been either looking for a church job myself, a worship leading job myself, and or I've been connected with pastors that are looking, like I mentioned earlier. Some of my heart is to have conversations with pastors and kind of provide more of this consulting role of let's address some of these things and let's dig a little deeper. And so these are the 5 things that I jotted down. The list could be more, and you may not agree with all the areas I'm going to list today, but these are things from several years of experience in making observations. I think these are some of the mistakes churches are making, and hear me in that. I'm afraid that some of these will cause you, the pastor, if you're watching this, to become a little defensive. My encouragement is look at these, listen to these with an open mind, and just take a good assessment and say, is this something that we could work on as a church? Is this maybe a blind spot that we didn't realize? But keep in mind that these may not all relate to your context. You may disagree with my observation in this. I don't claim to be the know-it-all in this area. These are just my 5 mistakes or observations of mistakes that I'm seeing churches making that I think is prohibiting them and making it hard for them to hire their worship leader. Number 1, not properly defining their reality. And this seems kind of vague, but what I mean by that is some of these pastors that I've worked with over the years, they come out of a church planting organization. And so they've gone through these assessments and these trainings. Maybe they even had a sending church that provided a lot of training and set them up to plant their church. And in that training, in those assessments, that becomes what they expect to happen or play out when they launch their church. Their reality may be different than their sending church or the assessment or the church planting organization they went through. Not just for church planners, but I think pastors that are from an established church and have been struggling to hire for quite some time, I wonder if they've not properly defined their current reality, their current context. So that's what I mean by that, like taking a good look at what our context is. And maybe that's the demographic. Maybe that's the area. Maybe that's the resources. But I don't want to bleed into my second point because a couple of these points really dovetail one another. And they're just an extension of the previous point. So that's point number 1, not properly defining their reality. Number 2, and again, this is very similar, or it's an add-on, goes very well with that point number 1, is unrealistic expectations. One of the things that I'm noticing, we have this dollar amount. I've been meeting with this one church and I set them up with a worship leading candidate. Basically, they're paying this candidate who is picking the songs, leading the rehearsals, leading Sunday mornings, scheduling both production and worship, and putting together worship slides. So a lot of the things to pull off a Sunday morning, they're not considered a staff role, or it's a contract role, but nonetheless, they still have, if you did the math, that's probably about, let's say, 3 hours on Sunday, 1 hour for rehearsal, 4, and then 1 hour to prep for Sunday. And that could be on the low end. So we're talking a good 5 to 6 to maybe even 7 hours per week. And they are paying this contracted worship leader $150 a week. That is not very realistic. And we're going to dive into some of the pay range a little bit here in a second, but that's just one example of kind of an unrealistic expectation. Is we want them to lead all these areas and to achieve all these things, but our pay or our compensation to them isn't matching up. And so it's kind of creating this unrealistic expectation. Another example of this is I was candidating. I don't know if that's a word, but I use it like it is. But I was interviewing with this church and not too long ago. And we had a couple interviews. I'd actually gone and guest led. And so we were going through the job description and Actually, I was going through the job description on my own time, and they did have it broken out very well. They said this is a flexible position. At the bare minimum, it could be a 10-hour position. At the most, it could be a 24-hour a week position. So they kind of had it broken down based on the hours would equal what they were going to compensate, which makes sense. So their areas of breakdown was clear. But as I started going through those and kind of looking at the compensation with the breakdown and then the hours with the breakdown, how many hours they were allotting per responsibility, I began jotting some notes down. I'm like, this isn't quite adding up. Like, I think they're undershooting the hours per responsibility. And sometimes that does get kind of squishy. I like to use the word squishy, meaning it becomes a little bit subjective and you can't just say, here's a one for one. But in my years of experience and kind of knowing what certain things typically take time wise, I was like, this is a little bit undershooting. So then that's kind of creating, I think, unrealistic expectations. And they weren't intentionally doing that, obviously. So it's just something I felt like I wanted to point out to them. So I see that happen with several churches that I'm in contact with. They not only, number one, need to define their reality, but number two, have a realistic expectation as opposed to unrealistic expectations. Number three, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose some of you on this one, is afraid to take risks. So here's what I want to say with that. Formulas tell us one thing, but it doesn't always equal our reality. I'm kind of touching back to point one and point two, and it doesn't always equal a realistic expectation. So what I mean by formulas is, like, I've read this recently and I've heard one of these churches I was working with make this statement. They're like, man, we're only in a position to hire a contracted worship leader. So not even part-time, just contracted, where you're just kind of doing the bare minimum, if you will, picking the song, scheduling the team, leading Sundays and rehearsals, which, like we did the math earlier, that still could lead up to about 7 hours a week, depending on some of the details. They knew that they weren't in a position to hire even a part-time position, so that's why it was contracted. They average, or run, if you will, attendance-wise, just a little bit under 100 every Sunday. And the stat that this pastor gave me, they're like, man, we would love to be able to offer a part-time position even, but until we grow another 75 people, we're probably not going to be in that range. And so I've read that, and that was the first time I heard it, but then I've read that since then, that tends to be kind of a generalized stat, that if you, for every 75 to maybe 100, 125, give or take, can justify a staff hire. Now, again, there's still other parameters. That's not the only rule to that. But my point in that, those aren't bad things to keep in mind and to kind of use as a generalized rule of thumb, but that's a formula. And formulas will tell us one thing, but it doesn't mean that that's what we should try to go by. And I'm not talking about not being a good steward of your finances, because that's biblical. We need to be a good steward of our finances. And if we were just to give money away that we don't have and go into debt, that's not financially responsible, and that's not God honoring. But I think what's happening is, because of those formulas and those stats and those benchmarks that we are trying to hit, we then become very timid in our leadership, and we're afraid to take risks. What would be the risk? I'm not going to fill in that blank. I'm going to let you kind of chew on that. Maybe take a kind of a personal assessment of your church and your leadership, and you're like, okay, man, maybe this is one reason why we're struggling to hire this position. Maybe we need to risk a little bit. And what would that risk look like to then get this hire that we're needing to lead our ministry? And I will add to that, sometimes when we're afraid to take risks, it also can lead to a narrow-minded way of thinking. Like, this is the only way forward. And we then are closed off to seeing other potential creative ways and outlets or creative opportunities that could help us make that higher. Point number 4, or mistake number 4, we're unable to think outside the box, or even we're unable to think big enough. And so, again, this sort of dovetails off of number three, just like one and two went really well together. Three and four go pretty well together. This narrow minded way of thinking, I know I mentioned that in the last point, but that's also a part of this where we're just not thinking outside the box. And this kind of goes back to point number one as well. We've had the proper training, the assessment, the sending, maybe even we've studied this in seminary or college and we've read about it. You fill in the blank. This limits us to thinking bigger, which then is that's also an avenue of just not thinking outside the box. Man, we're in a different time than we were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And so the things that worked for churches in general 5 years ago, they don't work now in 2025. And so part of that is like, okay, we've got to think of creative ways. We got to think outside the box. We got to think bigger. And I wonder if that's a prevalent mistake that we're unaware of, that we're just not thinking big enough. And that is what's hindering us from hiring our next worship leader, worship pastor. And then last, mistake number 5. Sometimes I think there's too many voices in the process. I've just recently been interviewing with different churches. And so I've had a good 3 or 4 experiences here at 3 or 4 different churches where I went through some type of interview or round of interviews, and every church does it different. Like one of these interviews, I first met with the pastor and the assistant pastor, and then next I met with the staff team, the leadership team. The final part of that interview process, which I didn't get to there because I withdrew my name. Just felt like the Lord wasn't leading me to take the next step, but was then to meet with their personnel team. And I think that included some elders. And so I'm sharing all this because you have elders, you have staff, you have maybe congregants that are part of your music team, your worship team, and they've been there for a long time. And maybe they are providing an interim support for you while you're looking. And that's helpful, guys, because you don't want to rush the process. You want to try to get it right. And so you're doing your due diligence to try to gather as much information on the candidate that you're interviewing, if you've made it that far. But my point in this, I'm kind of sidetracking a little bit, is with all these voices informing our decision, I think sometimes I'm seeing that's becoming a prohibitor of making the hire. I'm going to be the first person to raise my hand. I'm the type of person that I try to gather all the details before I make a decision. And I've been accused of taking too long and overthinking to make a decision. So I'm the chief, if you could say, sinner in that. I don't really think it's a sin, but I'm the chief practicer of that. And so don't hear me saying that it's wrong to do your due diligence and to listen to the people that you've surrounded yourself with, the voices you trust, the people that that have high influence on your ministry team, but also take a step back and say, do we have too many voices here? And is that muddying the waters even? Because with those voices become opinions. And so that was just mistake number 5 that I'm seeing in some of these churches I talk with, is that I think there's just too many voices or cooks in the kitchen, if you want to use that analogy there. So what do we do? Okay, first of all, I told you at the very beginning, you may not agree with some of these mistakes that I'm listing. You would maybe have a rebuttal to those, or here's why this, or here's why you're wrong here. And I always welcome conversation. So if you want to drop a comment or connect through my social media or my YouTube channel or my website, I'm always happy to have a conversation. But my point in this is let's take a reflection. Let's take some intentional time to take a step back and take these points in consideration and align it with your church and your ministry and be like, are we doing this and we didn't realize it? And so my call to action, or my challenge to you guys, is to take a step back, spend some time with the Lord, maybe get out a pen and paper and just start writing your context. What is your current reality at your church? Maybe as detailed of like, here's the equipment we have, and here's the equipment we don't have, and maybe that's something that's deterring getting people to be interested in our church. And that sounds like a petty thing, but there's some truth to that. One church I was working with, it was hard to send people out there because they didn't have a sound guy, and everything was just kind of hodgepodge, and things would go wrong, but nobody would know how to fix it. And so the worship leader that I'm sending to guest lead and to fill in would have a bad experience because there was too many unknown variables, and it was hard to control those. And we know things happen. That's going to always be the case. But if you can control as many of the variables on the front end, so maybe that's what you should do, is take a look at your inventory, your systems, and is there things that we can improve to maybe increase our chances of making this appealing to somebody? And again, it sounds weird to say that because we hope that it's spirit led and not just a eye candy type thing. But it's another great tool. I don't know how you guys feel about Chat GPT, but like, you can go on Chat GPT and you can type in, and I did this because I just was curious, because one of the common things I'm seeing too is people don't know how to offer salaries for their positions, because there's a lot of factors with that: cost of living, where your church is located, the number of congregants you have, your church attendance makes a difference. The amount of experience a worship leader has makes a difference. The type of education they received makes a difference. And so what you can do, you can go into Chat GPT. You could say, what would be the best salary for a worship leader that has this amount of experience and is in this city, and our church is this size, and they have this amount of experience? I think I already said that. And you can put all your parameters in there and just see what it says. I'm not saying take that as the hard truth, but it will give you a ballpark of where you should be as a church to be able to offer salary or compensation to whoever you're looking for. So those are just some resources. I know there's other ones out there too. I'm just listing a couple free ones for you. But there's other organizations out there that will help you kind of get your definition of salary ranges per your church size and area and all that kind of stuff. And I hope this was helpful. I would love to have conversations. That's something that I do too that I don't think a lot of people know, is I would love to have consulting conversations with churches, and just to see if I can help provide some perspective from my years of experience. And I've been talking with several churches, so I'm kind of getting a good picture of different pain points and different struggles. And so if that would be a benefit to you, you can book a free discovery call on my website, and would love to have a conversation with you. Be encouraged, because even though I shared some common mistakes that I'm seeing, it doesn't mean that it's a hopeless cause. All right. Keep praying and keep seeking the Lord's face. But also take those personal inventories and see, is there things that we can do better? Are these things that we didn't even realize we were doing that is probably causing some dissonance or hindering the hiring process of why we still don't have a worship leader filled? So God bless you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.